John had been driving for Lyft for years, and he prided himself on being careful. He always avoided risky areas, especially during his late-night shifts. But one night, everything changed. It was past 2 a.m., and the streets were eerily quiet. The rain had started to fall, creating a soft patter on the windshield of his beat-up 2005 Volvo. John was about to call it a night when he got a ride request from a convenience store just a few blocks away. He hesitated for a moment. Something felt off. The store was in a part of town he usually avoided, but the fare was good, and he decided to take the chance. When he arrived, the convenience store was closed. The lights were off, and the parking lot was empty. John's gut told him to cancel the ride, but before he could, he saw the passenger. The man was pacing back and forth outside the store, wearing a hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. There was a hole in the sleeve, and his movements were jerky, almost like he was on something. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he was being followed. John's finger hovered over the cancel button, but for some reason, he didn't press it. He unlocked the doors, and the man slid into the back seat without a word. The moment the man got in, John regretted his decision. Most passengers would scroll through their phones or stare out the window, but not this guy. He just sat there, staring at John through the rearview mirror. His eyes were unblinking, and his expression was cold, almost angry. John tried to break the tension by turning on the radio, but the man snapped at him to turn it off. His voice was deep and raspy, like he'd been smoking for years. John complied, gripping the steering wheel tighter as they drove in silence. After a few minutes, the man spoke. "Have you ever picked up someone you shouldn't have?" The question hit John like a punch to the gut. He let out an awkward laugh and said, "Well, I hope not." But the man didn't laugh. He just leaned back and muttered something under his breath that John couldn't quite hear. Then, the man started telling a story about how he used to be an Uber driver. He said some punks had stolen from his car, and that's why he quit. His words were slurred, and John couldn't make out everything he was saying. But one thing was clear: the man was smiling the entire time. A normal person wouldn't smile while talking about being robbed. John's pulse quickened. He kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. The man's final words sent a chill down his spine. "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." John's hands were shaking as he glanced at the GPS. They were only a few minutes from the destination, but the man wouldn't stop talking. He started babbling about nonsense, some of it concerning, some of it just gibberish. Then, he began apologizing to someone. John wasn't sure if it was him or someone else. "I didn't mean it," the man kept saying over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." John didn't respond. He was too scared to say anything. When they finally reached the destination, the man suddenly yelled at John, accusing him of missing the turn. John knew he hadn't missed it. The GPS showed they were on track, but out of fear, he slammed on the brakes and pulled over. As soon as he shifted into park, headlights appeared behind them. It was a police car. John said a silent prayer as the spotlight swept over his car. The man in the back seat slouched down, trying to stay out of sight. John watched as the police car crept past them and disappeared down the road. The man lifted his head and said, "You got lucky." Then he opened the door and vanished into the night. John ended his shift early that night. He was too shaken to keep driving. A few weeks later, he came across a news article about a convenience store robbery that had happened on the same night he picked up the man. The store was just 2 blocks from where he had picked him up. To this day, John wonders what could have happened if he hadn't pulled over. He installed a dash cam the next day and has been much more cautious about who he lets into his car. Alex had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. after a traumatic experience left him with a rare case of phonophobia, a fear of loud noises, he knew he needed a change. That's when he found the cabin. It was buried deep in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. The nearest neighbor was a 10-minute walk away, and there was barely any cell service. It was perfect. The cabin itself was small but cozy. It smelled like pine and old books, and the thick wooden beams gave it a rustic charm. Alex felt at peace for the first time in months. About a week after he moved in, there was a knock at the door. It was his neighbor, Michelle. She was an older woman with long gray hair and piercing blue eyes. She handed him a basket of preserves and said, "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." Her words sounded more like a warning than advice, but Alex brushed it off. He thanked her and set the basket aside, not thinking much of it. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in. Alex lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the sound of the rain. But then, there was a loud banging at the door. It was Michelle, soaked to the bone. She claimed she had seen someone near his woodpile. Alex was confused. Her cabin was 10 minutes away. How could she have seen anything? He stepped outside to look, but the storm made it impossible to see anything. Michelle told him to be careful and then walked away, disappearing into the rain. Alex locked up the cabin and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. But later that night he heard a branch snap outside his bedroom window. He crept to the window and saw Michelle standing at the edge of the woods, staring at his cabin. The next night, things took a turn for the worse. A burly, bearded man showed up at Alex's door, banging loudly. Alex called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. When they went to Michelle's cabin, they found it abandoned. No one had lived there in decades. To this day, Alex doesn't know who or what Michelle was. Some say she was a spirit trying to protect him. Others think she was a squatter, hiding in the woods. But one thing's for sure, Alex never went back to that cabin. Luke and Catherine had been together for 3 years, and they had a tradition of splitting Christmas between their families. Every year, they would spend Christmas Eve with Luke's family, and then drive through the night to Catherine's house. It was a quiet, peaceful drive, just the two of them. The snow falling lightly, and the music playing softly in the background. But this year, something happened that would change everything. Luke's phone rang. It was an unknown number. He ignored it, thinking it was a scam call. But then it rang again and again. Finally, he answered. On the other end was a man's voice, a voice he didn't recognize. The man started reciting personal details about Luke's life. His full name, his address, even where he was driving that night. Luke's blood ran cold. But then the man said something that made his heart stop. "I'm not here for you, I'm here for Catherine." Luke pulled over, his hands shaking. He tried to call the number back, but it was no use. Catherine hung up the phone, terrified. The rest of the drive was silent. Neither of them spoke. To this day, they still don't know who that man was, or how he knew so much about them.